Hello, hello, and welcome to another Joe and Kat Chats.
Absolutely.
Today we're talking about colonialism.
Yes, we are.
How are you, Joe?
On fire. On fire. As my Spanish brothers and sisters would say, en fuego. As my French brethren and sisters would say, en feu. On fire today. I'm feeling good. How about you, Miss Wells?
Amazing. Yeah, I'm feeling really well as well. I was sick last week, so I'm glad that I'm feeling much better, ready to rock, ready to talk about some serious implications.
Absolutely. Serious implications.
Are the legacy of colonialism.
Serious implications. Just one quick question I have for you. You said you're ready to rock, but are you ready to roll?
Oh, always.
That's what's most important, because anybody can rock, but not everybody can roll. You know what I mean?
That's fair.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
I'm a roller.
Yeah. So just want to make sure we clarify that before we dig in.
I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I mean, in true form, I guess we should get going and define what colonialism is.
Colonialism. Yes. Well, you know what? People talk about colonialism. It's like, well, what is colonialism? Colonialism is when one country essentially takes possession of another country. It's just, hey, you know what? We're country A and we see country B. We want country B. And there's not really a whole lot you can do about it. It's the practice of domination of one country over another country. In plainly said, it's a land grab.
Yeah.
It's a land grab. It's a land grab. Now, there's a variety of ways that colonialism can take place, but usually it's for economic purposes, usually. Now, there's another ism that I think we need to discuss that is closely related to colonialism, but not exactly the same as colonialism, and it's imperialism. Now, imperialism is when you have the political and economic domination of one country over another. But it's not necessarily an out and out land grab, or we're taking your real estate, or we want these square acres or square miles from you. It's, hey, you know what? We want to have regime change in your country, or we want to knock on your door like Elon Musk is doing with Evo Morales and Bolivia and say, hey, you know what? We want your lithium because that would be really good for a Tesla and really good for the United States, but not really good for you. That is imperialism. Colonialism, again, we want all your land and anything that's on it. Natural resources. Oh, but most importantly, the world's most important asset and the most important resource, which is people, human beings.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think in colonialism, there is something that we a lot of definitions miss, which is the creation of dependence on sort of the colonizer, of the colonizees, or the people being colonized. There's also like a sense of conquering in these, both imperialism and colonialism.
Absolutely.
So there's just like these aspects of it that aren't necessarily talked about, but have huge social and cultural implications, even though we're defining these things as sort of like the political and economic, or, resource and geographic land issues. But the implications are very real in political, economic, cultural, social ways.
Exactly. When you think about colonialism, in many instances, the colonizers usually indoctrinate the indigenous people of their land with the colonizers' customs and culture. Take, for instance, language. We're going to talk about Africa later on today. There's a whole lot of people who look like me in Africa that speak perfect French or perfect Portuguese. And years in the 1400s, they weren't speaking Portuguese and French. How did that happen? Colonization. There are certain dietary habits and music and art and dance, religion, other cultural practices that many indigenous people pre-colonization were not adopting. then colonization took place, specifically European colonization in a lot of instances. And then you had a whole lot of people, again, that looked like me, or maybe a little bit lighter skinned, or maybe a little bit darker, that speaking different languages and eating different food and listening to different music and practicing different religions, most notably Christianity. And and being forced to learn different systems of education and adopt different systems and standards of beauty and acceptance, whether it was artistic or physical or psychological or emotional. And all of that happened through colonialism. Now, there's another terminology that I think we also need to bring into all of this, because we've talked about colonialism, we mentioned imperialism, we've to go back to high school and college and graduate school, we've compared and contrasted colonialism and imperialism. But empire, we want to make sure that we define what an empire is. And an empire is a state with several entities, and it's usually ruled by a person who controls the empire, which is an emperor or an empress, depending on the gender of the person in charge. Now, an empire, when you think about many of the empires that we've seen historically, the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, you think about China and Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan and their empire and how they basically took over all of China and much of Asia. These are empires where it is more than just a land grab. It's a land grab that is, in addition, continuous, but then there are, how can I say this? There are franchises, so to speak, or satellite areas. Let's say this is a college, but you might have another campus that's away from the main campus. That's empire in another form, in another way of describing it. So it's just a matter of having different places and different spaces. For example, France is an excellent example of an empire. I think at one point, France had colonized at least one landmass in every time zone of the world.
Wow.
And I'm going to say that again. At one point, France had colonized at least one landmass in every time zone of the world.
I had no idea that that was the case. That's a really incredible fact. That is a very strange thing to think about.
Think about it. And there's
Yeah.
24 time zones.
Yeah. Wow. That's the entire world.
That's literally the entire world. There's a couple of years back, I was fortunate enough to play a show in Hanoi, Vietnam. And if you go to Vietnam, the official languages of Vietnam are Vietnamese. The other language is French. If you go to Tahiti, the capital of Tahiti is a city called Papeete. Tahitians speak French. If you go in certain parts of the Indian Ocean, in certain parts of certain islands off the coast of Africa, Madagascar is a French-speaking country. If you go to, I think the Maldives, I think our French-speaking country are French-speaking. There are certain parts of India where, in addition to many of the other Indian subcontinental languages, there's a large contingent of people in India who are speaking French. In addition to, obviously, a good chunk of Europe, obviously France, Belgium, Luxembourg. I know some parts of Luxembourg speak French. And the western section of Switzerland is also French speaking. For example, Geneva. When you go to Geneva, no one says Geneva, it's Genève. And everyone there speaks French. The signage is in French. So you don't see stop, you see arrête. You don't see exit, you see sortie. It's French speaking there. So look where you are in wonderful Canada. Okay. The Canadian languages, two official languages, are French and English.
Yeah, we have an entire province that is primarily French speaking.
Quebec.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a really interesting point, which I think we should explore a little bit further, because
I agree.
these language is a really interesting thing to look at, because it's very regional. It's
Absolutely.
totally influenced by colonialism, and it doesn't actually have the same borders as the political borders that we're used to
That's
seeing
not.
on a map.
That's correct.
So I think that's a really interesting thing to sort of look at when you're examining colonialism, because the borders that were created and are basically maintained for the last like 60-ish years, those were pretty arbitrary, and they were created by colonizers for, like you said before, like they were like just doing a land grab, and they were trying to get as many resources as they could, which
Mhm.
included humans as resources. It
Absolutely.
includes environmental resources. It
Mhm.
includes all of the other things involved in human civilization. But it also caused a lot of conflict between groups, because these borders were arbitrarily placed, and that was used by the colonizers to their advantage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it absolutely was. And specifically in Africa, there are certain areas in Africa where you had certain tribal groups that were split apart simply on the basis of random geographical selection.
Yeah.
So, hey, let's put a border between Chad and Sudan. Oh, but you know what? The people of Chad and the people of Sudan are actually quite similar. But because you're on this side and you're over here, Sudanese people, and my condolences to everybody in Sudan who is dealing with that historic flood right now. 500,000 people Sudanese, 500,000 Sudanese displaced, over 100 dead as a result of these massive floods that are taking place in Sudan. It's one of the mentioned that as we go along. But because you're in Sudan, oh, well, you're going to be colonized by the British. And you're going to be primarily an English-speaking country, maybe a little bit Arabic towards the south. But Chad, wait a minute, Chad was colonized by the French. So in Jamena, the capital city, you're going to be speaking French. Maybe you'll get some Arabic too, but mostly French and some other indigenous African languages that are going to be in that area. So language is going, you know what, Catherine, now that we're talking about language, that should be a future Joe and Cat chats. And
Mm-hmm.
we're going to take notes on that because yeah, there's a lot we can talk about with
Yeah.
language. So yeah, we're gonna dive into that. We're gonna dive deep into that. But you mentioned earlier on, eloquently, I might add, you said, you know what, human resources. You said, you know what, these colonizers took humans and they said, hey, you know what, we want humans to be the resource that we need so we can continue our imperialist and capitalist and colonizing ways. And I don't think we would be committing an act of negligence if we did not mention Christopher Columbus.
Mm-hmm.
Because think about what Christopher Columbus did. Now, most people think that Christopher Columbus was a Spaniard. He was not. He was an Italian. He was an Italian explorer that decided to work for the Spanish, for King George II, if I'm not mistaken. There were several explorers that did a lot of work for the Spanish and Portuguese empires many, many years ago, probably about 600 to 650 years ago. Obviously, we talked about Christopher Columbus. Let's not forget Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama was a Portuguese explorer that decided to sail to India, and he began much of the colonization of India and Southeastern Asia and Asia. Ferdinand Magellan was another Portuguese explorer, and he was the first explorer and sailor to circumnavigate the earth. And when his voyages stopped, he decided to, he landed in an archipelago of islands that we now call the Philippines. We now call the Philippines. And there are many statues and monuments for Ferdinand Magellan around the world. In fact, a GPS system is named Magellan in reference to Ferdinand Magellan. Okay. Amerigo Vespucci was another Italian explorer, similar to Christopher Columbus. And he was a merchant, and he also worked for Spain, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, excuse me, in the late 16th century, which makes total sense because most of the two dominant countries that were doing a lot of the colonization in the late 1400s and into the 1500s were the Spaniards and the Portuguese. And another explorer that I think we need to mention is a gentleman named Pedro Alvarez Cabral. And you're like, well, Joe, who's that? I've never heard of him. I've heard of these other guys. I've heard of Amerigo Vespucci and Amerigo, America. Okay, I get it. Columbus and Columbus Day, but we're not celebrating that because, you know, he's a terrorist.
Yeah.
But Pedro Alvarez Cabral, he was a Portuguese explorer that decided to say, hey, you know what? Da Gama's going to India, and Columbus, he's doing stuff in the Caribbean, and Magellan, he's all the way in Portuguese in the Philippines. You know what? Let me go to this big other area called South America. Oh, wait a minute. This is now present day Brazil. Mm-hmm. So Pedro Alvarez Cabral is an explorer that essentially began the gateway to the colonization of Brazil by the Portuguese. And several minutes ago, you and I discussed language. And you said, hey, you know what? Language, a lot of language comes through colonialism. Let's not forget that South America, with the exception of Suriname, which was a former colony of the Dutch, all the other countries in South America speak Spanish, except for one, and that one being Brazil. And Brazil, they speak Portuguese. It's actually technically called Brazilian Portuguese because there are some differences between Brazilian Portuguese and Golan Portuguese and Portuguese that is spoken in Portugal, in Lisbon and Braga and Porto and many of the other cities in Portugal. But Brazilians speak Portuguese as their main language, or what's called in linguistics as your A language or your mother tongue. So again, when we talk about colonialism, the direct connections between colonialism and white supremacy cannot be ignored. It cannot be ignored. And in many instances, with regards to these five gentlemen that I've mentioned, and there are others that we will mention throughout this discussion, it's, again, white people, white men specifically, going to areas where there are people of color and saying, hey, you know what? You're darker skinned than me. You should work for me. And oh, you see all these resources, like these palm trees and these spices that you all, and teas that you all got in India. Oh, and all of these fish and all the seafood you have in the Philippines. Yeah, we're going to take some of that and we're going to bring it back to Europe because we don't have it, we want it, and we don't want you to have it.
True. Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what happened. Although I will say that it was a lot more violent than what you just said.
Yeah. You know, there might be some school kids. There might be some. First of all, out to all the teachers that are using Joe and Cat chats as a way to deal with anti-racism and educate their students. Second of all, out to all the teachers that are doing amazing work right now, because I can't imagine doing this every day with 30 other people, young humans, in a screen, and trying to keep them engaged and organized and active and attentive. So shout out to all the teachers. I appreciate you. And I know, Catherine, you do also.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, it's important that we have these discussions and talk about all of these things because, again, if we don't talk about it, no one's going to talk about it. No one's going to talk about it.
That's fair.
No one's going to talk about it. No one's going to talk about it. Now, we want to continue on with more of the history because, again, we don't cover just current events. We give you the whole deal, the whole situation, the whole situation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, France and Spain were doing a lot of the colonization. Mm-hmm. So they were the ones that had the big armadas, the big navies, and they were just going everywhere and saying, hey, you know what? We'll take that land. We'll take this. We'll take this. Oh, you dark-skinned people, come with us. If you remember when I was in Fort Monroe at that Point Comfort on August 20th, 1619, if you remember vividly what I said that was read on that placard, it was a group of 20 or some odd Negroes that were taken from an area known as present-day Angola, and they were brought on a Portuguese ship. Okay, and that was in 1619. Now, what I'm going to talk about next is how the Portuguese empires and the Spanish empires began to lose a lot of their influence around the world, and three other countries began doing much more of the colonization. Okay, England, France, and the Netherlands. Now, let me go back to what I talked about a couple of seconds ago about the first Africans that were brought to North America on August 20th, 1619. Those Africans that were taken from now present-day Angola, they were brought on a Portuguese ship. That Portuguese ship was captured by a British ship. Whoa, how did that happen? Well, it happened because England, France, and Netherlands decided to take over because of Spain and Brazil. I'm sorry, Spain and Portugal losing a lot of their esteem. How did that happen? It happened because the Spanish and Portuguese brought over a lot of illnesses and a lot of sickness that were not native to where these people used to living. So what happened is many of the native populations of these indigenous areas began to die off. They began to die. So quite literally, colonization was killing people. Not only the indigenous people that they wanted to have empire over, but the Spaniards and the Portuguese that were doing the colonization. If you look at many of these explorers that I mentioned earlier, they didn't live to be 80 and 90 and 100 years old. No. They were dying. I mean, I'm 44 years old. These cats were dying late 40s, maybe early 50s. They didn't live long lives. And there's a reason for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it is sort of worth noting that. I appreciate you sort of explaining that, because it is a bit convoluted sometimes when you look into it. But yeah, so England, the Netherlands, Germany were kind of the next wave of colonizers. I don't know if you want to speak to some of the people involved, but once sort of the Americas and Asia had been conquered and claimed, Europe then turned to Africa. So this sort of happened in sequence with what you just said too.
Absolutely. There's much of that did happen. And if you take a look at the chopping up of Africa, and I'm going to use this term, and I'm not going to use this term in a glib sort of fashion or haphazardly. I'm going to use this term because of the significance of it. The balkanization of Africa, which seems strange to say because the Balkans happened 30 years ago, and the breaking up of Africa into different parts took place 350 to 400 years ago. But most of Africa began being colonized by France, Germany, Belgium, and Italy. Now, there are some people that we need to discuss when we're talking about the breaking up and the colonization of Africa. One gentleman who is just as much of a terrorist as Christopher Columbus is a gentleman named Cecil Rhodes. Okay, Cecil Rhodes, that name, the last name sounds kind of familiar. We'll talk about that. He was a gentleman from the United Kingdom, and he said, you know what? I'm going to go to Africa. And, oh, I hear there's diamonds in Africa, especially South Africa. Oh, okay. These people here don't know how to mine these diamonds. And we can get these diamonds for ourselves and make lots of money and enslave them in the process. Wow, let's do it. So Cecil Rhodes goes down to South Africa, creates, I think, what's called the British South African Company. And then he creates a diamond company known as De Beers. Okay, you can still go if you...
It's a well-known company today.
Well-known company today. If I ever decide to get married again and spend money on an engagement ring, I will definitely not be buying a De Beers diamond, because that's upholding white supremacy. We don't want to do that, because that's not what Joe and Cat chats are about. It's not what we do here. We don't do that here. So he starts the Beers Company. And then he says, you know what? I got diamonds, but I want land too. I want land too. So there's a large landmass just north of South Africa that was at one point called Rhodesia and was named after him. There are statues in many of these capital cities in Zimbabwe, which I think the capital is called Harare, Harare. For the life of me, I cannot remember the capital of Zambia. I can't remember everything off the top of my head. I know I missed that episode of Jeopardy. I'm sorry. But this one landmass was called Rhodesia. Eventually, it was broken up, and it's now Zimbabwe and Zambia. Okay? Cecil Rhodes made so much money off of diamond and enslaving African people that he said, you know what? I'm going to start a school, and I'm going to start a scholarship fund for really, really smart people, really, really smart children and students. And I'm going to name it after myself because why not?
That's what white supremacists do.
That's what white supremacists do. Hey, let's name a landmass after me. Hey, I'm going to have a scholarship named after me. Called the Rhodes Scholarship. Okay. There's also a highly regarded university in South Africa, which is also named after Cecil Rhodes. It's called Rhodes University. So Cecil Rhodes did a lot of terrible stuff that we're not even going to talk about on this video because we've got other things to discuss. But another person that goes relatively undiscussed with regards to white supremacy and empire and imperialism and colonialism is King Leopold II. Now, King Leopold II was around in the 1600s, and he colonized Belgium. I'm sorry, he was from Belgium, and he colonized an area which is now was formerly known as Zaire, but now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo and Congo. And he said, hey, Congo, they've got rubber. That's a really good natural resource. Wait a minute, you mean we can go to the Congo and we can enslave these people? And if they don't produce enough rubber, we can cut off their hands and maim their bodies? We can do that and get the resources and have nobody to deal with this? Let's do it. So that's what happened. So King Leopold II, during his reign of terror, killed something in the neighborhood of 15 million Congolese people. That far surpasses any of the genocide that Christopher Columbus committed against Native Americans. Far surpasses that. But most people kind of just skip over King Leopold. It's like, King Leopold, whatever. He might be he's probably the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
In June 2020, on Belgian Independence Day, there are a whole lot of people that look like me in Belgium, in various cities in Belgium, Brussels, Charleroi, Ghent, name the city in Belgium. They were there. And people were just like, you know what? If these Confederate statues of white supremacists can come down in the United States, you know what? We can tear down these statues of King Leopold and dump them in the river. Let's do it. So that's what happened. Many protests were taking place and happening in Belgium as a result of King Leopold and his legacy of white supremacy. And to revert to episodes 13 and 14 of our ongoing series, the Joe and Cat Chat series, we talked about how the Congo is now going back to Belgium and other countries that were colonized by Africa, going back to Belgium and saying, yo, Belgium, you enslaved us. We want reparations and we want it now.
Yeah.
Hurry up, write that check, please. Write that check. So that happened.
Yeah.
That happened.
Totally. Yeah. So, we have talked about this a bit before as well. So yeah, I do encourage people to go back the last couple of weeks and look up our episodes on reparations.
Real quick. Not only go back and watch episodes 13 and 14, binge watch us. Watch all the episodes.
Watch them all.
I
was going to say, we also mentioned this in our episodes about global issues, which are episodes 12 and 12 and a half. So
that's exactly right. Watch all the episodes. Don't skip over like, this school episode's okay, but I don't have any kids and I'm not in school. No, watch it anyway.
Yeah, I don't have any kids, and I thought it was a very interesting and important conversation. So yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. See, and I have a kid and she's in school now. So I absolutely, and an ex-wife who's a teacher. So I absolutely thought it was necessary.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely.
So I guess I kind of wanted to bring this conversation into, I guess, a more modern, way that we're going to talk about it. I want to talk
Sure.
about colonization
Yes,
in the
absolutely.
sense of how it is today,
Mhm.
because I find that while the history is really important, and I encourage everybody to look into it and read as much as you can, because it's
Mhm.
both interesting, horrific, and really
Necessary.
important, so necessary to know this stuff. I think that a lot of times when people talk about colonization, they sort of talk about it as though it is in the past only, and it's very much alive and well today.
Super alive and well. Super alive
Yeah.
and well.
So one of the sort of noteworthy moments was the formulation of the United Nations in
Absolutely.
1945, which spurred a bunch of countries to establish autonomous statehood, which was technically just a political gesture.
Sure.
But it doesn't mean that the legacy of colonial rule went away, because it's still very much embedded in our cultures, in our social lives in general. And like you mentioned before, like it's language is one of the most obvious ways that we can sort of discuss and really see how the legacy of colonialism is still alive and well. Most of our government systems are based on Christian, Western European, laws and practices, which are all colonial in their roots,
Absolutely.
among other things. So I read an article that um, I pulled a quote from, which I thought was good. The quote is colonialism
Mhm.
made the political world map look much as it does today, drawing up borders with no regard for local sensibilities and realities.
Mhm.
It negated or purposefully misconceived the cultural, economic, political, and social conditions under which the colonized led their lives. So I liked this quote because it's sort of just cut and dry. It's like, yeah, they had no regard for the local sensibilities, but I would argue that it doesn't actually go far enough, because it
Okay.
neglects to mention how colonial powers negated and misconceived the conditions in which the colonized lived through
Interesting.
violence,
Mhm.
oppression, and mass genocide, which
Absolutely.
includes coercion and forced assimilation. So yeah, so I wanted to kind of throw that at you and see what you say about that, because I think this conversation needs to be had in sort of a modern sense as well.
I agree. And first of all, thank you for doing the homework and finding that quote, because that is an excellent quote, because it kind of alludes to what I was speaking about earlier
Mm-hmm.
with regards to Africa, for example, where you have these arbitrary boundaries that are just, hey, you know what? This tree looks good and we can see for 800 kilometers. Okay, we'll just draw a straight line down here, even though these people of this country and this country have the same phenotype, but we're going to split them apart because we feel like drawing a border here. And you're going to speak a different language than these people because we put an imaginary line here and we don't care what you say. That happened, and it happened. And there's another another example of maybe not necessarily drawing arbitrary boundaries for land masses, but another example of the colonization of a particular region and how different groups of people colonizing different areas influence the way people go about their day-to-day lives, even to this day, is the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
Is the Caribbean. Now, it, what most people may or may not realize is that Spain in the early to mid, actually really in the 1500s, did a lot of the colonization of the Caribbean, And they colonized a lot of the big islands in the Greater Antilles, a lot of these smaller islands in what are known as the Lesser Antilles, and much of Central America and into northern parts of South America was colonized by the Spaniards. Okay, let's fast forward to today. Take a look at the dominant language of Central America. All of that's Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
All of it is. The Spaniards colonized much of Peru and parts of Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
What are they speaking there? In parts of Venezuela, what are they speaking there? They're speaking Spanish. Now, again, as Spain began to lose their vice grip-like control of the Caribbean, some of the larger islands, like a Cuba, which is Spanish speaking, and Hispaniola, which at one time was entirely Spanish speaking, but then Dominican Republic remained Spanish speaking, but the other side, Haiti, became French, and we will talk about Haiti later on in this episode. But much after a while, the Spanish Empire said, you know what, we're losing our strength. French, British, and Dutch took over, and then they began to colonize. There were many wars that took place as a result of the colonization, okay? And a whole new regime of people that came over, specifically, mostly from England, decided to do a lot of colonization. There's a gentleman named William Penn. You're like, Penn? That last name sounds familiar. It should, because he was British, and William Penn eventually founded that area north of Maryland known as Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
That was him. He was involved with another group of people known as the Quakers. Mm-hmm. That was William Penn.
Penn State.
Well, actually, let me correct you. Not Penn State, but the University of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. The University of Pennsylvania. Penn State is that because William Penn, they occupied a lot of the area which is around what's now called Philadelphia. University of Pennsylvania is downtown Philadelphia. I've driven past the campus a bunch. Penn State is nowhere near. Penn State's in an area called State College, Pennsylvania, and it's kind of in the northern central part of the state, and there's nothing around in that area, which is called Happy Valley, but there's nothing in that area other than the school. If you're not going to the school, there's no reason to go to Penn State at all, to go to State College, Pennsylvania. The University of Pennsylvania, or UPenn, that's Philadelphia. And William Penn was responsible for that. So he saw this one island, and he saw a lot of Black people there and say, hey, you know what? I'm taking this land. And the British are going to rule over this land for the next 3 centuries. That land mass was called Jamaica. Now, take a look at what happened with the UK controlling Jamaica for over 300 years. And Jamaica gained their independence in 1964. And then the Windrush generation that decided to resettle in England. And now England has decided to send away many of these people who were part of the Windrush generation back to Jamaica for various reasons, because their immigration paperwork wasn't correct, or they didn't get citizenship done the right way, or they're not working. Do you see the connection between all of this?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting point, or an important point, because like this is happening as we speak. Like this is happening today. They didn't get their independence until, the later half of the 20th century. Like this is modern.
1964, if I'm not mistaken. 1964, I think it was.
Yeah, that's what you said. So yeah, this is happening as we speak. And I just want to make sure that people understand that this is like not something that we should be talking about as a distant past, because the legacy is still happening and people are still being displaced because of this.
Right. And I apologize. It wasn't 1964. They actually gained independence the same year that another British colony, the country that I hold near and dear to my heart, Trinidad. I mean, take a look. Here's Trinidad flag right here.
Nice.
Okay. Trinidad was also a colony of England until 1962. And Jamaica also gained independence from England that same year.
Oh, okay, yeah. 62.
Yeah, so it was not 64, it was 1962. I apologize.
Yeah, it's just wild to me to think about how these countries are gaining independence while, the civil rights movement is, gaining momentum at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is not a far or distant memory. These are very recent events.
These are really recent events. I mean, you mentioned the civil rights movement taking place in the United States. Let's not forget that many of these colonies in the French colonies in Africa, also gained independence in the early to mid 60s.
Mm-hmm.
So if you really look at if you were locked, I wouldn't even say locked away. Let's say you were in a time bubble, or you were Rip Van Winkle and you fell asleep in 1959 and you woke up 45 minutes ago and you had a map of the world in your back pocket and you took it out and you were like, yo, what's this USSR? Oh, wait a minute, Yugoslavia? What is that? Oh, wait a minute. Did England own a bunch of islands in the Caribbean? Now there are places like Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados and the Bahamas and Grenada and St. Lucia and St. Vincent and Antigua and St. Kitts and Nevis? What is all of this?
Mm-hmm.
They're independent countries? I thought England had them under control. That happened.
Yeah.
And wait a minute, what about all of this stuff in Central America? Didn't Spain own all of that? Now it's Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras and Nicaragua and Costa Rica and Panama and Ecuador and Colombia. Venezuela. Wait a minute, when did all this happen? But that happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then the English also owned another piece of Central America called Belize. Mm-hmm. And they became independent in 1981. The British also owned a piece of South America, all the way down in South America, which is called British Guiana. That's not just Guyana. And they got their independence in the 60s, in 1966, if I'm not mistaken. And let's not forget, the Dutch was also heavily involved with colonizing much of the Caribbean. One of the islands is St. Martin, okay? There are 3 islands in the Caribbean that are just north of Venezuela. They're called the ABC Islands. They stand for Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. Mm-hmm. Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. The dominant language there, most people there speak Dutch, but one of their indigenous languages is a language called Papiamento. But Papiamento is not nearly spoken as much as Dutch is now because of Dutch colonization. Mm-hmm. Because of Dutch colonization. And the Dutch said, hey, you know what? There's a piece of South America that we'd like to have also. But I think it was 1975, if I'm not mistaken, they said, you know what? Oh gosh, we'll give these people their independence too. And that country in South America is now known as Suriname. Mm. It's now known as Suriname. And there are loads of people that look like me who lived in Dutch Guiana that travel frequently from Dutch Guiana, which is now known as Suriname, back and forth to the Netherlands because they were former colonies of the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. And you will see a lot of people who look like me speaking perfect Dutch. And there's a reason for that, because of colonization of the Caribbean. And France had a lot of colonization also. There's a Saint Martin, which is on the other side of Saint Martin, which is a Dutch side, and then there's a French side. But earlier on in this discussion, I mentioned an island called Hispaniola. Hispaniola is now 2 countries. It is now the Dominican Republic on the eastern side, and on the western side of the country is a country known as Haiti, which is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And I know in our reparations episode, or episodes, I think we mentioned in both episodes, we talked about Haiti. and how Haiti was colonized by the French, and then the slaves in the enslaved people of Haiti said, you know what? We're tired of being slaves. We're not doing this anymore. So a Haitian gentleman by the name of Toussaint Louverture led the Haitian Revolution. And they said, hey, you know what? We're going to get our independence. But because the French government was so hell-bent on making sure that they extracted every possible resource out of the Haitian people, they came over with the French Navy and they said, hey, you know what? It'll be a shame if something happened to your country, and we really don't want to bomb your country out of existence. So in order, you, Haitian people, have to pay us, French people, reparations. You have to pay us for your freedom. That happened.
Yeah.
That happened. And for the life of me, I cannot remember the dollar amount, but
I can't remember
it's
either.
it's probably approaching trillions of dollars now, because they've been paying that debt to France for the better part of over 150 years now, as a result of them gaining their independence. And when you have that sort of constant debt peonage from one country to another, which goes back to what we talked about, colonialism, imperialism, and empire. Okay. And I said, with empire, you have a satellite, you have a bunch of people who are controlled by one person, which is usually an emperor. When you have this sort of political instability that takes place on a generational basis, you end up with people who are inside of these countries eventually becoming dictators.
Yeah.
And you could take a look at what happened in the Balkans, and demagogues like Slobodan Milosevic or Franjo Tudjman, who became the first president of Croatia. In fact, the airport in Zagreb, Croatia is named after him, Franjo Tudjman International Airport. In Haiti, what I need everybody to do is look up Jean-Claude Duvalier and his son, he's known as Papa Doc Duvalier, and his son, Baby Doc Duvalier, and what they did to the Haitian people while the majority of Haitians are mired in generations of poverty. I want you to take a look at what each of that family, the Duvalier family, a group of Black Haitians, did to their own Black people. Because we don't have enough time in the episode to talk about all that right now.
Yeah, I wish we did, but we're running out of time. But you did bring up a couple of points that I wanted to make anyway, which is great, because I also wanted to just finish our discussion today on how colonialism is really upheld today.
Yes,
and I think that sort of economic dependence and resource economies is a big one.
Absolutely.
The history of reparations with Haiti is one that is repeated through other places too, which I encourage people to look into, because it's backwards. I'm not going to mince words. Like, that is backwards. That should not have happened that way.
Should never have happened.
And so when you have countries that are economically dependent on others because of this, it just makes the rich richer.
Absolutely.
And there's a reason why the top 1% that's, been sort of in common knowledge since Occupy in 2011. There's a reason why these people are white men from Europe, descendant, wherever they are now, I don't know, but there's a reason, and that's colonization. Constant war is one that sort of upholds the colonial ways in which globalization happened. Even the USA has military bases in over 80 countries worldwide.
80 countries. The US right now has an active military presence, I think, in 35 countries in Africa.
Oh, you cut out a little bit there.
I'm sorry, I did not mean to cut out.
Recording.
Yeah.
Didn't
It's still recording.
mess up.
It's still
Okay.
recording.
Okay.
It's still recording. Okay.
Um,
I can always edit the video, so we can do that. But all right,
right.
let's start again.
Yeah. So, yeah, I can't believe how many military bases are just, yeah, it's in an effort to perpetuate war and just keep the sort of military industrial complex going, because that is
Absolutely.
a huge moneymaker, going back to sort of the economic dependence of globalization, which is tied to colonialism. Displacement is a part of that as well. Both with like the war argument and the regional conflicts that have led to sort of mass migrations because of the systems set in place by colonial powers include things you just mentioned: corrupt governments, resource extraction, things like cash crop systems that have been implemented.
Absolutely.
And another thing you just mentioned was sort of the tied to resources. I can't remember what exactly you were saying, but it made me think about the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is something that
Absolutely.
was established to, with the sort of veil or guise that they were going to help these economically poor, quote unquote, countries, gain economic independence after their political independence, again with air quotes. And they established this sort of cash crop system where they would basically plant one thing that sort of the global north would want, like coffee or chocolate or sugarcane, all sorts of things that aren't useful for sustenance, but do feed the sort of globalized superpowers that still exist because of the legacy of colonialism. And another point for displacement is the indigenous folks that were just given sort of, in North America at least, they were just given sort of these lands as reservations, and just, that's yours, which has caused so many social issues like poverty, unemployment, drug abuse, suicide rates are high. And that has led to intergenerational trauma, which is a conversation for another day, but
Absolutely.
I just wanted to mention it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think another way that colonialism is upheld, and I know we're running short on time, is, and I know I mentioned this in a couple of different episodes, and it's eventually going to be another topic of conversation in the continuation of the Joe and Cat Chat series, is the refugee crisis. Okay, is the refugee crisis. And in addition to colonialism with regards to displacement and mass migration, you can also have statelessness, and you can also have people who are what is known, or what is known as internally displaced people, otherwise known as IDP. And yes, so we cannot forget people who are also internally displaced as a result of colonialism, and that's been happening on several different occasions. In addition to colonialism, it also is, in many instances, colonialism, if we looked at some of these people that we've talked about, like a Cecil Rhodes or a Vasco da Gama or Amerigo Vespucci or a Cabral or a Christopher Columbus, and I've consistently used a word over and over again as an adjective for these men, is terrorists. Okay. Now, colonialism also feeds into terrorism. It plays a role into that. So again, when you have colonialism and you have countries that have been formerly colonized, there is a tendency for their governments to be destabilized or unstable. Take a look at what is happening in much of Africa right now with Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Al-Nusra Front, many of these terrorist organizations that are taking over in many different countries across Central Africa, just south of sub-Saharan Africa. The northeastern section of Nigeria is taken over by terrorists. Central African Republic, much of that is terrorism in that area also. Chad, terrorist activity from Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front, Al-Shabaab. So you have terrorism in these areas where there is government instability. One more thing I also wanted to mention with regards to colonialism and countries breaking up and mostly white men taking over. I think a perfect example of countries breaking up and white men taking over, especially the natural resources of these countries, is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, otherwise known as the USSR. Because when the USSR broke up into, I think, 15 different countries, the majority of the people who became the richest people in those new countries, like a Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan or Georgia or Moldova or Azerbaijan or Latvia or Lithuania or Ukraine or Belarus, they were white guys that typically took over the natural resources of these countries, mostly in natural resources, gas, a lot of it is gas, electricity, and textiles.
Mm-hmm.
There are plenty of examples of these that we can discuss. For example, Roman Abramovich, who's one of the richest men in the world. He's the owner of Chelsea Football Club. He has a master's degree, I think, in petroleum engineering from one of these Russian universities. Made his money with the breakup of the Soviet Union, made it with oil. Mikhail Prokhorov was a former owner of the New Jersey Nets, worth about 12 or 13 billion dollars. He made much of his money with the breakup of the Soviet Union through textiles. It's a clothing manufacturer. So, and again, they don't look like me and they don't look like you. They're white guys.
Yeah, for real. Yeah, I mean, we could talk about this for another hour probably, but yeah, the one thing that I want to sort of reiterate is just that when we talk about this concept of colonialism, it has real implications, and that's, I mean, what we've been sort of bringing to our Joe and Cat chats in general. Like, we talk about these sort of abstract things and we try to ground them in reality because they have real social consequences.
Yes.
As you know, one of your favorite quotes as
from Dr. David Lee.
yes,
Race is not a thing. Exactly.
yeah.
Do you remember the rest of it?
I'm trying to get better at remembering people's names who say these quotes. I'm not very good at it. But
He said, race is not a thing. It is a relationship.
yes.
Race is biological irrelevance with fatal social consequences.
Exactly. Just like many of the concepts that we talk about in all of these Joe and Cat chats. So we are running out of time. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. These are always such a pleasure to be able to express and discuss, and have conversations are so important.
Absolutely. I feel the same way. You're my sister for life, and don't forget that.
Oh, of course, my brother for life too.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
How much time do we have left? We have about 30 seconds or so.
We have a minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some closing remarks.
Mm-hmm.
Next week, colorism. We're going to talk about that. Colorism, again, is a form of discrimination. We're going to talk about that. And again, we want justice for Breonna Taylor. We want justice for Elijah McClain. We want justice for George Floyd. We want justice for Jacob Blake. We also want justice for a Colombian man named Javier Ordóñez, who was a victim of police brutality last night in Bogota, Colombia. And that's all my family and all my brothers and sisters in Bogota, Colombia right now. Please stay safe.
Yes, truly. Yeah, and I just want to close out with something I heard in a webinar yesterday. It was a teach-in with someone by the name of Desmond Cole, who, if you don't know, please look up. He's brilliant. And he was talking about, in regard to sort of the police thing that's happening right now with abolition, he was saying something along these lines. Slavery was long enough ago that we perceive it as bad, and we feign disbelief that people could be so cruel. But what is happening right now is just the same, but it looks different to us because we're in it.
Correct.
So we cannot divorce the conversations that we are having about racial justice and police abolition from the broader system of capitalism. And so I thought that was really relevant to bring into today's conversation, because if we cannot understand how the legacy of colonialism is still alive and intimately influencing all of modern society and civilization and all the rest, then we cannot even begin to understand or move toward a just world.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. All right, we have to go, but thank you again.
You're very welcome, Catherine. See you next week.
For sure. Bye.
Peace.